After 5 years of unwavering loyalty, a horse leads his keeper into the storm, and what they uncover will change everything. The gentle wind brushed through the rolling green pastures of a small New England town, carrying with it the echoes of a place steeped in quiet endurance. At the edge of the village stood an old iron gate, its once bright paint weathered and peeling. This marked the boundary of Carta's Meadow, where a commanding black stallion named Shadow roamed, a creature as unyielding as the land itself. His coat shimmered in the soft light of dawn, and his deep, thoughtful eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if searching for something, or someone. Shadow had belonged to Captain Ethan Carta, a beloved figure in the community who had ridden him into battle 5 years ago. Before leaving, Ethan had entrusted the care of his treasured horse to Grace Sullivan, a young woman who had grown up working at the Carter estate. Over time, her bond with Shadow had deepened, though she knew it could never replace the unique connection the horse shared with Ethan. Each evening, Shadow would pace the meadow and return to the gate, standing as if frozen, seemingly waiting for the sound of galloping hooves announcing his master's return. The townsfolk had grown accustomed to this poignant ritual. Some saw it as a moving testament to loyalty. Others, sipping whiskey at the tavern, muttered that it was a hopeless gesture. War changed everyone, they said, if they made it back at all. But Grace refused to relinquish hope. She spent her evenings at the gate beside Shadow, reading aloud from the letters Ethan had sent during his time at the front. Yet it had been many months since the last one arrived, and the silence gnawed at her, though she hid her fear well. The scent of impending rain filled the evening air as Grace brushed Shadow's sleek mane in the stable. The horse remained calm under her touch, though his ears twitched at every sound from the meadow. "Still waiting, aren't you?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "Me too." Her words lingered between them, fragile yet resolute. Later that night, as Grace was preparing to close the stable doors, a sharp, urgent whinny pierced the air, sending a chill through her. She raced outside to find Shadow at the gate, his hooves pounding the ground with a frantic energy. His head was held high, nostrils flaring as he let out a desperate neigh into the darkness, as if calling for something unseen. "Shadow, what is it?" Grace's voice trembled as she ran to him, her heart hammering. The stallion turned to her, his dark eyes filled with an urgency she didn't understand, then snapped his gaze back toward the horizon. Shadow pawed at the ground, his powerful body trembling as though the very air around him had shifted. The distant toll of the village bell echoed faintly, warning of an approaching storm. Pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, Grace looked toward the darkening sky, though it wasn't the weather that sent a shiver through her. It was the unshakable feeling that something monumental had changed. Just as Grace reached to soothe Shadow, a sudden flash of lightning lit up the landscape beyond the gate. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement on the horizon, a shadow that seemed deliberate, not the mere stirring of the wind. She blinked, and it was gone. "What are you trying to tell me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Shadow let out a piercing cry, his hooves striking the ground with renewed force. The rain began to fall, heavy and relentless, but Grace stayed rooted to the spot, her unease growing. Whatever had unsettled Shadow, it wasn't over. Not yet. As the night wore on, the rain pounded against the stable roof like a relentless drumbeat. Inside, Grace sat beside Shadow, her back against the sturdy wooden walls as she tried to make sense of his behavior. The stallion, usually fearless, stood restless, his eyes fixed on the stable doors, as though expecting them to burst open at any moment. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the fields shrouded in a thick mist. Hoping to calm him, Grace led Shadow into the meadow, but his ears remained alert, his gaze darting repeatedly to the horizon. The other horses in the neighboring paddocks were peaceful, grazing without a care, seemingly unaffected by whatever had stirred Shadow. "Grace?" A familiar voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Luke, the blacksmith's apprentice, jogging toward her. His cheeks were flushed from the crisp morning air, and his expression held both concern and curiosity as he approached. "There was a buzz at the village tavern last night. News from the front lines had spread. Some soldiers were finally returning home." Grace's heart raced with a flicker of hope. "Did they mention Captain Carter?" she asked, her voice tight with anticipation. Luke, standing nearby, shook his head cautiously. "Nothing about him specifically," he admitted, his tone somber. "But they say the survivors. They've been through hell." The words hit Grace like a blow, heavy and unforgiving. For 5 long years, she had clung to hope, each letter from Ethan like a lifeline, filled with promises of a future they'd share. Yet the silence of the past months had grown deafening, doubts creeping in like shadows she couldn't dispel. She had never dared speak those doubts aloud, not even around Shadow. Somehow, she was convinced the horse could sense her turmoil as vividly as she sensed his. Later that afternoon, as she cleaned the stable, her fingers brushed against something hidden deep within the hay. Curiously, she pulled it free, only to gasp in shock. It was a medal, dulled and worn but unmistakable. Ethan's name was etched on the tarnished brass. He had shown it to her before he left, a token of valor from a previous campaign. "How did this end up here?" she murmured, holding it to the light. Shadow shifted restlessly in his stall, his dark eyes tracking her every move. "Did you find this?" she asked him, half laughing at the absurdity of addressing the horse. Yet something in his gaze unsettled her, as though he was trying to tell her something. Sliding the medal into her pocket, unease settled over her like a cold mist. If Shadow had uncovered it, where had it been hidden, and why had it surfaced now? The days that followed were anything but calm. Shadow's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He pawed relentlessly at the ground near the gate, circled the meadow with a wild energy she'd never seen before, and refused his usual meals. Grace tried everything to soothe him, but nothing worked. The villagers began to take notice. "That horse is losing it," Mrs. Hargrove muttered as she walked by, shaking her head. Others were less charitable, calling Shadow's distress a bad omen, proof that Ethan wasn't coming back. Some even urged Grace to sell him, claiming he was becoming a liability. But Grace couldn't bring herself to part with him. Shadow wasn't just a horse. He was her last connection to Ethan. Selling him would feel like giving up on Ethan himself, and she wasn't ready for that. One evening, as the golden light of dusk bathed the fields, Grace sat by the gate with Shadow by her side. She clutched Ethan's medal tightly in her hand, her fingers tracing its edges over and over again. "You miss him too, don't you?" she whispered softly. Shadow lowered his head, his warm breath brushing against her arm as if in quiet understanding. The next morning brought an unexpected arrival. A group of soldiers trudged into the village, their uniforms battered and their faces hollowed by exhaustion. Grace's heart leapt, and she rushed toward them. Among them, she recognized Sergeant Dawson, one of Ethan's closest friends in the unit. "Sergeant," she called, grabbing his arm with trembling hands. "Do you know anything about Ethan?" "Captain Carter." Dawson's expression darkened, his hesitation palpable. "The last time I saw him," he began, his voice faltering. "It was chaos, Miss Whitaker. We were under heavy fire, and the captain stayed behind to cover our retreat." Grace felt her world tilt. "Stayed behind," she repeated, her voice trembling. "What does that mean? Is he—" Dawson shook his head, his voice heavy with emotion. "I don't know. All I can tell you is that he fought like hell to keep us alive. If anyone could survive, it's him." As Grace returned to the stable, her mind raced with Dawson's words. Shadow greeted her with a sharp, piercing neigh, his agitation more intense than ever. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if the horse knew more than she did, if his restlessness was somehow tied to Ethan's fate. The thought had barely formed when Shadow let out a powerful cry and bolted toward the gate, his hooves tearing into the earth with unrelenting determination. "Shadow!" Grace shouted, her voice catching in her throat as she ran after him. The morning air was cold and thick with mist, the fields barely visible under its shroud. Shadow galloped ahead, his black coat glistening with dew, his movements purposeful and unyielding. Grace's breath formed clouds in the chilly air as she clutched Ethan's metal tightly, her legs propelling her forward. "Shadow, stop!" she called desperately, but the stallion didn't falter. He moved as though he knew exactly where he was going, leaving Grace with no choice but to follow. Whatever lay beyond the gate, Grace was certain of one thing. Shadow was leading her toward it, and she had to find out why. Driven by an inexplicable pull, Grace's heart raced as she pursued him, a strange and unwavering instinct urging her forward, as though destiny itself had taken her by the hand. The open meadow yielded to a dense cluster of trees, their bare branches stretching skyward like skeletal fingers piercing the foggy air. The ground beneath her feet was treacherous. Roots and rocks jutted out unpredictably, while the mist thickened, wrapping around her like a shroud. Her footing faltered on the soft, damp earth, but she pressed on. It had been years since she'd ventured this far beyond the village, not since her father's death had rendered the woods unfamiliar and hauntingly empty. Shadow paused abruptly, his nostrils flaring as his ears twitched. He stamped at the ground in a flurry of movement, his agitation palpable. "What is it, boy?" Grace asked, her breath coming in gasps as she reached him. Shadow's gaze fixed unwaveringly on a dense patch of undergrowth. Hesitating, Grace stepped closer, her hands trembling as she knelt by a twisted old oak, whose roots wove into the ground like an intricate maze. There, tangled in the roots, lay a weathered leather pack. Its straps were worn, and the cracked leather seemed as old as the tree itself. Grace's breath hitched in her chest. She tugged the pack free and opened it, her fingers trembling as she worked the clasps. Inside, a journal rested, its pages warped by moisture and time. The initials EC were etched into the cover, faint but unmistakable. Tears stung her eyes as she flipped open the first pages, revealing a collection of sketches and short notes, entries Ethan had penned before departing for the war. His words, though faded, carried the weight of his dreams, fears, and love for Shadow. One passage caught her eye. "Shadow isn't just a horse, he's my partner, my anchor amid the chaos of battle. I trust him more than I trust myself. If I don't make it back, I pray someone keeps him safe. He's earned more than a life of waiting." Grace swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she turned the pages. The writing grew increasingly sparse, the strokes frantic, almost indecipherable. The final entry sent a shiver through her. "The fighting is worse than I ever imagined. If we survive this, it will be because of Shadow. He saved me once already, shielding me when the shrapnel came too close. If I don't make it, I hope he finds his way home. He always knows the way." Shadow snorted softly, pawing at the ground as if to remind Grace of his presence. Rising, she clutched the journal tightly to her chest, her eyes meeting Shadow's. In that moment, an unspoken connection passed between them. The fear and uncertainty that had gripped her melted away, replaced by a profound sense of calm. It felt as though Shadow was silently assuring her that everything was happening as it should. "You knew, didn't you?" she whispered, a voice filled with wonder. It was as if he had brought her here to remind her that Ethan was still with them in some mysterious way. Shadow let out a sharp whinny, his muscles tense as he shifted suddenly and began moving deeper into the forest. Grace had no choice but to follow. The journal held tightly against her chest. The woods grew darker, the trees crowding together as the mist thickened. Each step was a challenge. The mud pulled at her boots and she stumbled, scraping her palms against the rough bark of a tree. The cold air bit at her skin, but she pressed forward, driven by the sense that Shadow knew exactly where he was going. The forest path narrowed into a deep ravine that Grace barely recognized, a place she'd visited only once as a child. Faint memories stirred of a hunting trip with her father, the thrill of adventure, and stone markers that served as guides. The significance of this place resonated now, the echoes of her childhood blending with the urgency of the present. Pausing to catch her breath, Grace's mind raced, trying to piece together her surroundings. Then, like a spark of clarity, a memory surfaced. The large stone marker her father had shown her, a weathered slab etched with time, not far from where she stood. The realization steadied her. She was certain of the direction now, a deep sense of familiarity cutting through the disorienting mist as she set off toward the stone, her resolve growing with each step. Shadow halted at the edge of the ravine, his sharp gaze locked onto a dense cluster of trees ahead. Grace followed, her heart pounding like a drumbeat in her chest. Beneath the gnarled roots of an ancient oak, she spotted a shape, a figure partially buried under a mix of leaves and damp earth. Her breath caught, and she dropped to her knees, her fingers trembling as she reached out. It was a man. His uniform was torn, his face hidden beneath a mask of dirt and despair. But there was no mistaking him. "Ethan! Ethan!" she cried, her voice cracking as it shattered the quiet. At her call, his eyelids fluttered open, his gaze locking onto hers for a fleeting, heart-wrenching moment. "Shadow found me," Ethan murmured, his voice barely a whisper. A sob escaped Grace as she pulled him into her arms, holding him tightly as though her embrace could shield him from the icy grip of death. Shadow stood vigil beside them, his warm breath a comforting presence against the chilling rain that soaked them both. The stallion had led her through the labyrinth of the forest, beyond the safe, familiar borders of the village, to this place where Ethan had waited, fragile and fading. Shadow nickered softly, his ears flicking as if to say, "I knew where you needed to be." Grace's hands shook as she brushed mud and rain from Ethan's face, her chest tightening with both relief and fear. The clearing around them was foreboding, the wind wailing through the twisted branches while rain battered the earth in an unrelenting rhythm. Ethan's skin was pale, his breathing shallow, but he was alive. That was enough. Shadow, as steadfast as ever, stood protectively over them, his large frame a shield against the storm's fury. His dark eyes met Grace's, and in them she saw something almost human, an urgency that matched the dread building in her chest. "Stay with me, Ethan," she pleaded, her voice breaking as tears blurred her vision. "You're not leaving me. Not now." Her surroundings felt impossibly distant. The forest, an endless tangle of shadows and obstacles, its uneven floor slick with mud threatening to pull her down at every turn. No one else would come. The soldiers she'd left behind were too spent, and she was utterly, painfully alone, save for Shadow. With a surge of determination, she tore a strip from her rain-soaked skirt and began wrapping Ethan's wounds, her movements frantic but deliberate. The sight of his blood was a cold fist squeezing her heart, but she refused to give in to the panic clawing at her insides. "You'll be fine," she whispered, her voice trembling as though she were trying to convince herself as much as him. Ethan flinched at her touch, his eyes flickering open for a moment, before closing again. Desperation threatened to consume her, but she clung fiercely to hope. Shadow snorted sharply, pawing the ground, his attention fixed on a barely visible path ahead. Grace looked up, drawn by the urgency in his stance. His eyes burned with purpose, an unspoken command that stirred something deep within her. It was a look she recognized, one that mirrored the unwavering strength Ethan had once shown. She nodded, drawing a shaky breath. "All right, boy. Let's get him home." Summoning every ounce of strength, she hoisted Ethan, his weight a crushing load against her slight frame. Shadow remained still, his head bowed in quiet understanding as Grace draped Ethan carefully over his back. The stallion stood firm, aware of the fragile life he now carried. Gripping the reins tightly, Grace began to lead him through the relentless storm. The path was treacherous, the mud threatening to swallow them whole with each step. But Grace pressed forward. Each stumble and fall only hardened her resolve. Shadow moved with care, his steps deliberate as he worked to keep Ethan balanced. Every step forward was a triumph, a tiny beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the village appeared in the distance. The warm glow of its windows was a promise of safety, a reminder of everything they had fought to preserve. Grace's legs burned, her body ached, but she refused to stop until they were home. Grace's voice cracked with exhaustion and the chill of the evening as she called out desperately. Figures began emerging at the edges of the small town, their footsteps quickening as they ran toward her. "Help! Please, someone help!" she cried, her voice raw with urgency. Luke and Sergeant Dawson reached her first, their faces etched with concern. Dawson froze when his eyes landed on Ethan, slumped and barely conscious across Shadow's broad back. "It can't be," he murmured, disbelief flickering in his gaze before resolve took over. "Get him inside, now," Dawson commanded, his tone steady. Together they gently lifted Ethan from Shadow's back and carried him into the warmth of the town's tavern. Villagers crowded around, their expressions a mix of wonder and fear as they saw the captain they had presumed dead. Blankets and steaming bowls of water appeared in moments as someone rushed to summon the healer. Standing drenched and trembling in the doorway, Grace watched as they worked frantically to stabilize Ethan. Shadow remained just outside, rain dripping from his mane. He stood motionless, his eyes fixed unwaveringly on the door. Grace stepped into the rain, resting a trembling hand on his damp neck. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude and awe. "You truly saved him." Shadow let out a soft whinny and leaned into her touch, his gesture a quiet acknowledgement, as if to say, "It was my purpose." Over the following days, Ethan's condition gradually improved. The healer spoke of miracles, recounting how they'd battled to clean his wounds, stave off infection, and keep him warm through the perilous hours. But Grace knew the real miracle had been Shadow's unyielding determination. When Ethan finally regained enough strength to sit upright and speak, his first words were for her. Grace entered his room cautiously, her heart swelling as she saw the light of recognition in his eyes. "You found me," he rasped, his voice still weak. "No," she replied softly, her smile tinged with tears. "Shadow found you. He never gave up." Ethan's expression softened, his voice faltering as emotion welled up. "He's always been the brave one," he said quietly, "even when I wasn't." The tale of Shadow's loyalty spread like wildfire. In the small, tight-knit town, the horse that once bore the burdens of war was now celebrated as a hero. Children often ran to the meadow to glimpse the stallion whose courage had defied the storm. Shadow's legend grew, not just as a warrior's mount, but as a beacon of loyalty and love. One clear morning, with the sun casting a golden glow over the meadow, Ethan, still reliant on a cane, made his way to where Shadow grazed. From the stable, Grace watched silently, her hands resting on the gate as her heart swelled at the sight. Shadow's ears perked up, his head lifting as he recognized the sound of Ethan's steps. "Hello, old friend," Ethan said softly, his voice full of warmth. His hand rested on Shadow's neck, and the stallion closed his eyes as though savoring the moment. For a while, there was nothing but peace between them, no memory of war, no shadow of loss. As months passed and the meadow burst into a kaleidoscope of wild flowers, Grace often found herself reflecting on that stormy night. It lingered in her mind, like a vivid dream, replaying every time she saw Ethan and Shadow together. Both were healing in their own way, their bond growing stronger with each shared moment. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the hills in hues of amber and rose, Grace stood by the gate, watching Ethan ride Shadow across the meadow. Their silhouettes blended into the warm light, an image of perfect harmony. They waited for each other, she whispered to herself, her chest tightening with emotion. And they found their way back. Shadow paused, lifting his head as the wind tousled his mane. He let out a powerful resonant neigh, the sound echoing across the fields, a triumphant cry of loyalty, resilience, and a love so profound it felt almost otherworldly. In that moment, Grace believed in miracles. Wow, what an emotional journey this story has taken us on. I want to take a moment to reflect with all of you, because even though this is a fictional tale, it carries so much depth and meaning. Stories like this remind us why we love storytelling, because they let us explore the resilience of the human spirit, the strength of hope, and the bonds that truly stand the test of time. This story of Grace, Ethan, and Shadow isn't just about a horse or a war. It's about loyalty, love, and perseverance. Shadow symbolizes the kind of devotion we all hope to experience in our lives, whether it's from a beloved pet, a friend, or even within ourselves. Grace's unwavering determination shows us the power of holding on to hope, even when the odds seem impossible. And Ethan's survival. It's a testament to the miracles that can happen when we refuse to give up on one another. The story reminds us to value the connections we have with others and to cherish the things and people who stand by us through life's toughest storms. It's a beautiful, heartwarming reminder that even when life feels uncertain, there's always a reason to keep going. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What did you take away from this story? What part resonated with you the most? Let's talk about it in the comments below. If you've ever had a connection as deep and meaningful as Grace and Shadow's, I'd especially love to hear about it. Let's share our stories, reflect on the lessons, and grow together. And as always, thank you for being here and for letting me share this beautiful tale with you.